at this point, 6 months into an act of genocide, to condemn the only resistance group that's keeping Palestinians alive. And that's actually fighting the horrific Nazi army that's going and just killing people for sport at this point, I think is really, really ridiculous.
So yeah, Abby Martin, it's so good to see you, and thank you again for giving me some time. I was reflecting on how crazy and different the world was the last time I met you and we spoke. It was right before the 2016 election. Hillary Clinton becoming president was a foregone conclusion. And now here we are in sort of a Trumpian world. We're in a very depressing time. We're seeing a genocide unfold in Gaza. As we're speaking now, there's talks of World War III, and it genuinely feels like we might be on the precipice of something very serious. And I'm very grateful to have someone like you to speak to today, because I know you are paying very close attention to these things and you care and you're sincere about these issues. And I'm very grateful for this. So I'm excited to have you. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. It's good to talk to you again in such a weird, weird setting,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
How many years since we spoke last in that apartment in Brooklyn when we thought everything was so simple.
Yeah, just Hillary Clinton. We knew all about her and what to expect. So let's get into it on Israel-Palestine. And you've been reporting on this issue for a lot of years. You released a documentary in 2019, Gaza Fights for Freedom. But let's go back a step. Like, when was your political awakening on Israel-Palestine? When did you really start to care about this story?
Yeah, Ryan, it's always been folded in and baked into that notion of American exceptionalism. And just the idea that Israel is this, unshakable ally. It's essentially the 51st state. It's always been folded in also to the notion of the war on terror and the narrative that we were browbeaten with in a post 9/11 world. I remember, of course, that infamous shot that was just broadcast on every single news channel of quote unquote Palestinians dancing in the street celebrating 9/11. And because that was basically broadcast to Americans on the morning of 9/11 in such an emotionally driven way, I still hear Americans to this day, over 20 years later, saying Palestinians were to blame for 9/11, Palestinians celebrated 9/11, essentially just folding in Palestinians with that concept of Islamic terrorism and enemies of the West. And I remember Israeli officials on the morning of 9/11 also on C-SPAN talking about how now America understands what they've been doing. Their war on terrorism is now our war on terrorism. So it was always in the back of my mind. And I think that when you get radicalized and when you wake up to the true nature of U.S. foreign policy, Israel-Palestine is something that is part and parcel with that fundamental understanding. However, I didn't even know what Palestine was when I was growing up. I never even really heard of Palestine. Of course, we all know about Israel and how important Israel is to be an ally to the U.S., but Palestine is kind of in the background. Even taking a Israel-Palestinian class in college, I remember it was so overly both sidesing, really conflating the two sides. Even though I was being taught by a Palestinian professor, it was like really kind of ridiculous looking back on it that I took away essentially nothing from that class. It wasn't until I would say the 2010 Flotilla massacre that I really understood the egregious nature of the media coverage. I remember, for people who don't know the background, there's aid ships going to Gaza all the time. And this was one of many aid ships that were bringing, wheelchairs and things like that to the people of Gaza. And Israeli commandos in international water commandeered this ship and executed I think 8 or 9 people, including one American citizen. And I remember the media coverage. It was like CNN and MSNBC. We're not even talking about Fox News. They just took an IDF press release and a video that was put out by the IDF and showed people on the boat trying to ward off the IDF commandos with chairs and tables, and they were circling those people and saying they were using weapons. So trying to justify retroactively the fact that these people were just killed in cold blood. And I remember really at that moment, it was kind of a light bulb moment. Like there's something deeply, deeply wrong with the way that this is all being told to us and dictated, and none of this makes any sense. So I think I just dove headfirst, and then a couple of years later, working at RT and working alongside Palestinians who had to stop work completely and check in with their friends and family to make sure that they were still alive during 2012, during Operation Pillar of Cloud, I think.
Yeah, fascinating. We're going to talk a bit about Israeli propaganda because what's been happening since October 7th is insane and cartoonish, as you've said. So I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. But I've seen you talk about this issue, and of course, your sort of support of Palestine and your criticisms of Israel in this conflict have been, based a lot about the facts that you've seen from your own reporting. We'll talk about that in a bit. But you've also talked about the morality of this story. Could you break that down for me a little bit? Why, morally speaking, do you support Palestine?
Well, it kind of is cartoonish to look at things like in a black and white lens or like the evil. But really, I mean, Ryan, if you're looking at historically speaking, we have been, our understanding of this issue has been overly confusing and obfuscated. And it's really unfortunate. And that's very deliberate in terms of the Western media, the way that our political establishment wants us to understand it. They want us to basically think that unless you have like a PhD in Middle East studies, you can't possibly understand what this conflict is all about. It's a, decades old conflict warring over religion. These people will never get along. They've been fighting for hundreds of years. I mean, all of that couldn't be further from the truth. It really is like very simple, actually. We're looking at two sides that are egregiously not the same. Like Israel is an oppressive, colonizing force. It was a state that was created on top of an indigenous land that was full of people. And the foundation of Israel was ethnically cleansing that indigenous population. And the continuous growth of Israel is predicated on the continuous ethnic cleansing and expulsion of those people. So, for me, looking at Palestinians who are constantly subjugated, brutalized, humiliated in the West Bank. 3 million Palestinians live under this brutal military occupation that's akin to a fascist military dictatorship. And then in Gaza, of course, you're living under brutal medieval siege where you're occupied militarily by the outside. So for me, looking at millions of people who are denied basic human rights, living under an apartheid system, living under brutal military occupation, to me, those are victims. Those are victims of policies that are horrific crimes against humanity. There is no both sidesing that issue. Israelis are free to go wherever they want. A lot of Israelis aren't from Israel. They're from other Western nations or whatever. I mean, we know that right of return. You can be a Jewish person anywhere in the world and just move to Israel. You can ethnically cleanse a Palestinian village and move to Israel and move right there and be be aided and abetted by the state. So for me, it is a question of just simple morals. I have extreme moral righteousness when I look at an issue like Israel-Palestine because it's just so obviously naked. And when we look back, like if we look at something like October 7th and on the Pier Morgan show and we spent 10 minutes of this so-called debate where he's just basically demanding that I condemn Hamas. And for me, you're getting into a tricky situation where you're being asked to condemn people who are living under an oppressive system. We're not even talking about the atrocities or crimes that were committed on October 7th. I'm just talking about the actual both sidesing of Israel and Hamas. And there's just no comparison whatsoever, Ryan. And when we look back at the Nat Turner slave rebellion hundreds of years ago, no one is asked, is this a moral issue? It's so obvious. It's like you're not going to condemn the slaves for revolting. You can talk historically about why atrocities were committed or why some things happened the way that they did, but you would never condemn the slaves for breaking out of their shackles.
Yes, and I'm going to get into this question about Hamas because I know I want to engage on it on hopefully a more like enlightened, interesting way than you maybe got from peers. But before we move into that, and that was a great answer, and I appreciated that. A lot of people are pontificating about this story, and everyone has an opinion, right? It's a divided thing, but you've actually been on the ground. You've been to the West Bank, you've been in Israel, you couldn't get into Gaza because you were banned, and you can tell us a bit about that. But How did it change you? What was it like when you went for the first time? You literally witnessed the disparities and you saw this apartheid system and talked to people on both sides.
Yeah, I think we need to ask ourselves why we don't ever see Western media just interviewing Israelis, Ryan. This series of man on the streets interviews that I did in Israel became viral. And it was one of the only kind of snapshots of Israeli society. This was back in 2017. So mind you, a period of relative calm. There wasn't really much going on. Of course, for Palestinians, there's always things going on. But in terms of just society at large, there was really nothing happening. And, 99% of people I talked to within the 3 hours that I was in Jerusalem openly advocated ethnic cleansing or genocide. Every Israeli that I talked to when I was there, it was kind of the incitement of genocide, or the racism was palpable. And then, preceding that, spending 3 weeks in the West Bank before I even really stepped foot in Israeli society. And it was just such a stark contrast. I mean, I spoke and hung out with hundreds of Palestinians. Not one of them said anything remotely genocidal, racist, anti-Semitic. No one. I mean, it was just simply, we want to coexist. Why do they have to move right here? There's so much land. Why did they move on top of my home? And just that visceral kind of like nature of apartheid. I mean, I just remember the first thing that I saw when I was leaving the Ben Gurion airport was a giant line of Palestinians walking up this hill. And I asked our friend Nancy Mansour, who was taking us on the Existence is Resistance tour, I was just like, what's going on? She was like, oh, it's just a makeshift checkpoint that they set up to just inconvenience Palestinians day to day. So they'll just set up a blockade and then they'll just make Palestinians walk. So they take an extra 3 hours to get to their home as opposed to 5 minutes up this street. And I was just like, oh my God. And then like a couple miles later, we see an ambulance stopped and the police are searching the ambulance with the body out, and they're just searching it for bombs or terrorism or whatever. And then, of course, that person probably dies. And they do this frequently where they just prevent Palestinians from getting medical attention or aid and let them bleed out. There's so many stories, Ryan. I mean, every day when you're in the West Bank, there's more happening that an entire book could be written about. I mean, we were there when a farmer just simply got shot for not turning around quickly enough at an Israeli soldier. And we went to his family home later for the funeral. And as everyone is grieving, Israeli soldiers come up, set up a makeshift checkpoint outside and blockade. And then they start tear gassing and shooting rubber bullets at the funeral goers. So for me, it was absolutely horrifying to be on the ground. I mean, there's so many stories, going to Sebastia and seeing a Palestinian flag raised on a hilltop and being told that just a couple days prior, 2 Palestinians were sniped for erecting that flag. And they went back the next day and put it back up, even though those Palestinians could have been killed for doing so. So it's that resilience and it's the proud nature of being Palestinian, even though it's illegal to do these things and to show off your heritage and culture like that. But like just going through the checkpoints, being with Palestinians, being stopped by 17-year-old kids from fucking Silicon Valley with like assault rifles, just trigger happy assholes that could kill you in a heartbeat and nothing would happen. Knowing what's happened to Rachel Corrie, knowing what's happened to Shireen Abu Akleh, it just doesn't matter. There are no repercussions for these people. It was a series of horrifying events that really made me realize this is what Palestinians live through on a day-to-day basis. And one more thing, if I can, I think like the apartheid goes both ways because like looking at apartheid where you're like looking at the Dome of the Rock and realizing, across this beautiful countryside, Palestinians can't go there. Like for me, that's just so heartbreaking to know that they can't go to this holy because of the apartheid system, or the apartheid going both ways where these giant red signs telling Israelis it is illegal for you to enter into the Palestinian territories. So for Israelis, it's actually, they're forced indoctrination from cradle to grave, but also forced separation for Israelis to not enter and interact with Palestinians so they can't be humanized. So, yeah, I mean, countless stories and countless like emotions that really made me realize the depths of the problem. And I think the irreparable nature of where Israeli society is going and how fascism has really taken over. And I think that was so revealing about these interviews, is like people didn't realize how fascist Israeli society has become because simply no one lets them speak, because Americans are placated with like the spokespeople that are carefully trotted out for our audiences, and that's for a very intentional reason, because they don't want us to know. They want us to think that it's just Netanyahu.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go next, because your sort of commentary on the rot sort of this fascism in Israeli society really being a majority view, I believe comes across as controversial to some, or might surprise them. When we see these protests to get Netanyahu out of office, we know of all these brilliant Israeli anti-occupation activists, former IDF people breaking the silence, all these amazing groups. It feels like there is this, like in America, you have, well, it's not all Trump. America's not a lost cause. There's tons of brilliant Americans who give a shit and understand the world and are fighting for a different America. But in Israel, how can you speak so authoritatively about that rot? I know you've been there and you've spoken to people, but what else are you seeing that really makes you say that?
Of course, because you could just say that's just totally anecdotal. But I think, Ryan, I think it is really reflective of Israeli society. And unlike, look, I say the same thing about American society to a certain extent. I still think there is hope for change within American society, because I don't think it's deeply as fascistic as Israel. And I'll explain why. First of all, Israel, like I said, I mean, there's continuous ethnic cleansing going on every day. You have to be okay to a certain extent to be an Israeli citizen and to live under an apartheid state, where you have 3 million people who live adjacent to you living under this kind of military dictatorship. You have to be okay with the fact that Palestinians are living in an open air prison just a couple miles away. So that's first and foremost, is that ethnic cleansing and violent conquest and colonization is happening real time. This isn't about settler colonialism in America, where, you know, yes, we're all on stolen land. Yes, there was a horrific genocide of Native people. But that if that were happening right now, 10 miles away from me, you sure as fucking better believe that I would not be okay with that. So that's first and foremost. But when you look beyond the Likudniks and Netanyahu's, when you look at almost every single cabinet minister, policymaker, even the so-called liberal opposition, all of them are over there signing their names on the bombs that are dropped on children in Gaza. All of them are out there advocating the cutting off of aid, open policy of mass starvation. Leftism is a slur in Israeli society. That is absolutely a fact. There is a diminishing left, almost to the point of non-existence. And don't just take it from me or the authoritative figures in Israeli society that are out there spewing this kind of racism. It's actual polling that elucidates this point very clearly. And if you go back to 2014, 95% of Israelis supported that onslaught in Gaza, where 2,500 Palestinians were killed. But if you just keep going over time, the numbers become even more strong. 95% support the open fire policy at the fortified border fence. But looking at the genocidal onslaught today, Ryan, the fascism has become so consolidated because, look, for them, they had their 9/11, right? And so when you look at a post 9/11 world in the US, this unquestioning patriotism and nationalistic fervor really took root, and a lot of reptile brains were activated, and we saw what that translated to in American society was very ugly. But in Israeli society, I cannot even wrap my mind around kind of the mask off moment across all, generationally. It doesn't matter where you're from. I think that everyone kind of pulled their mask off and everyone's essentially on the same page. And polling today shows that less than 2% of Israeli Jews living inside Israel think that Israel has used too much firepower in Gaza. I mean, this was, and also think at that point, I think 25,000 Palestinians had died, and they said that it was completely justified. So that retaliatory kind of bloodlust and vengeance for Palestinians, I think, really is revealed in the polling, Ryan. But don't even just take it from the polling. Where is the opposition to the genocide? Where's the opposition to the war? It took months and months for even a handful of people to go out in the streets and oppose this. And they were interviewed and they said, we are scared of our lives for being out here right now, holding signs timidly on a street corner, probably about 5 people. And this was months into the genocide, saying ceasefire now, stop the killing. And they said that we are attacked, we are scared. It is dangerous for us to be out here. When you see droves of Israelis out in the streets in the tens of thousands demanding the ouster of Netanyahu, that is not because of the genocide. That is because the failed negotiated settlement that Netanyahu has refused to do because he doesn't give a shit about the hostages. And it's also because of corruption. They want Netanyahu to go because they see him as corrupt. This has been a years-long battle in Israeli society. And the problem is that the West keeps apologizing for this and claiming that it's just Netanyahu. When you have Bernie Sanders, people like Chuck Schumer saying Netanyahu has to go, this crazy right-wing government has to go, and then all the sins of Israel will be washed away and we can start anew. And I think that that's the dangerous mindset. That's the dangerous mindset to have, because this is rotted to the core. And if you have a society that's built upon ethnic cleansing, you have to have indoctrination that exists and is pervasive throughout the whole society. Otherwise, these policies simply will not work. So if Netanyahu leaves, the occupation still remains, right? Apartheid still remains. And unless we get to the heart of those policies, it will always beget violence, and we will always have that same problem that exists today.
Yeah. One question I want to make sure I get in that I've been thinking a lot when I was preparing for this interview with you is about the fact that you're a new mother. And you were talking about a genocide, and we're talking about so many dead babies and dead children. And I'm wondering, A, how motherhood has shaped you generally as you approach this messed up world. But when you're analyzing Gaza, how is it hitting differently for you now that you're a mother?
Oh, God. I'm going to try not to cry, Ryan, because it for the first couple months, I moved to Oregon on October 7th, actually. It was really kind of been a very tumultuous time trying to be in a new home, move somewhere to have space for my children, and like to watch, my daughter wasn't even a year old yet. And just to see, I've never seen anything more horrifying in my life. I mean, every day it's like you open your phone and it's just like, what new horror will surpass the limitations of human evil will I see today? And how many dead kids am I going to see today? And so for several months, it took a huge emotional toll, physical toll, and on me, and on my ability to even like parent correctly. Because on one hand of it, I was so immersed and felt like I had an obligation and a duty to do what I could because of our extensive work that we had done on this to combat all of the propaganda. So I was day in and day out leaning in fully to this, and then feeling like I was neglecting the fact that I have two healthy, beautiful children who they need me. They need me. But at the same time, it's like I felt like I had this duty to do this. I've definitely stepped back a little bit and realized that I do need to, my children need me as much as the Palestinian children need their families. But it's also this tremendous amount of guilt that I have looking at my kids and thinking, you're safe. And it's all because of geography. It's the luck of the draw. And it's the fact that you live here and you weren't born in Gaza. So it's been an absolute horror show to just think of how callous people are toward the sanctity of human life, especially when we're looking at helpless, innocent children, and how much the West dehumanizes children in Palestine and dehumanizes Palestinian lives in general, that they simply do not matter. The fact that I'm talking to you today, and I just found out 3 hours ago that 11 Palestinian children were killed in a drone strike when they were playing on a playground today in Gaza. And that just really shows you just the complete disproportionate nature of Israeli lives versus Palestinian lives. The fact that this isn't on every single front page of every newspaper. And this is the struggle that we have to keep fighting for. But being a mother is not making it any easier. It's making it a lot more difficult.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to lead into this question. I want to talk about the Pier Morgan debate, and I want to talk about Emily Schrader, because what I'm seeing now from this emotion is like you genuinely give a shit, and it's not a show. Like, you're involved in this emotionally, and you come on with this woman to debate. She's a pro-Israeli journalist. She has ties to the Israeli government, according to your sources. I'm going to trust you on this one. She denied that, and she's smiling. Like, you are grieved. You are talking about a genocide, it's not a smiling affair. And she is just joyous on that in that debate and enjoying this for some reason. How do you analyze people like Emily Schrader? What have they drank the Kool-Aid and they believe it and they're confident and delusional? Are they grifting a little bit? Like, who are these people, and what did it feel like to watch her smile at you talking about all this stuff?
Yeah, well, a couple points there. First of all, she made Aliyah and moved to Israel like in her 20s. So I have much less respect for someone who's just a transplant settler like Emily than I do for Israelis who are born and bred into this indoctrinated society. Emily is a disgusting person who, at this point in the genocide, to trot out someone like Emily Schrader, who has boasted herself in multiple publications that she has worked alongside the Israeli military and government for the last decade, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, as well as Stand With Us, which is a literal asset from the Israeli government. They have been paid $250,000 in grants, and that's just what we know of in a cursory Google search. So Emily is a lying propagandist. If she hasn't taken a paycheck from Israel, then that's almost worse. If she was just volunteering with the military for the last 10 years, like, that's bizarre. I admire her more if it was just like, okay, you're taking a paycheck because it's just a job. But no, if she's volunteering, like, that's crazy. But at this point in the genocide, to trot out someone like her, you have to be completely morally bankrupt and vapid enough to be out there as an apologist for 13,000 kids dying. And I don't think there's many people like that. And that's why you see these kind of vapid lunatics like Emily Schrader having to take that position where they're outright denying the death toll. And if they're not denying the death toll, then they're denying how many kids have died. That's a really tough pill to swallow. But for someone like Emily, I mean, they're not bringing their best and brightest, I think, because there's not many people who are willing to look completely insane on Western media to apologize for what's happening, but she certainly is.
Yeah, wow. And the big point on that, you alluded to this before, but it was this question of Hamas. Everybody like yourself, we've seen it with so many Palestinians and pro-Palestinian, will you condemn, especially Piers Morgan now, it's like a meme now, right? Will you condemn Hamas? And I think it's such an interesting one for me. It's such a fine line, right? It's like, to support the resistance, to support the only group that's able to actually resist and do something and is trying to do something, but also while, condemning killing civilians and knowing that that is happening and brutal things were done on October 7th. So on this question of Hamas, who are they to you and why are you so reticent to publicly condemn them and see that as sort of counterproductive right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the reason that I refuse to condemn Hamas, especially 6 months into an active genocide, is because it first of all, it makes October 7th appear as if it's the end all be all, that this is when everything started, that we have to condemn what Hamas did in order to criticize Israel. And it's the game that I refuse to play. And it's the game that's put on the pressure that's put on every leftist group that mounts a resistance or opposition to horrific war or war crimes that are committed essentially in our name. And you can go back to Iraq. Will you condemn Saddam? You have to condemn Saddam before you condemn the invasion of Iraq. Gaddafi. You have to condemn Gaddafi before you condemn the NATO bombing of Libya. And I think it's a really slick game that I refuse to play into. It's also this bizarre ritual that is forced upon us. You have to condemn the Palestinians before you can even criticize Israel. So, of course, I condemn killing civilians. I condemn atrocities. I think I don't have to agree with the tactics that happen. I don't have to agree with Hamas's ideology. Obviously, I differ greatly from what Hamas stands for in terms of their philosophies, but I do see them as an armed resistance group. They are the elected leadership of the Gaza Strip, and as the government of Gaza, they have done a lot to provide for the Palestinians. It's not just armed resistance. They were the entire infrastructural body that provided Palestinians life and the ability to survive under that siege. So at this point, 6 months into an act of genocide, to condemn the only resistance group that's keeping Palestinians alive, and that's actually fighting the horrific Nazi army that's going and just killing people for sport at this point, I think is really, really ridiculous. So, I think you can parse that and just be like, I don't agree with tactics that happen. I don't agree with killing civilians, obviously, as a strategy. But I absolutely refuse to condemn the prisoners for breaking out of the prison. And I think going back to the Nat Turner thing, it's like we don't condemn the slaves for breaking out of their shackles. We can understand historically why things happen that we consider offensive. But certainly you would never ask someone to condemn the slaves or the prisoners for the prison break. So I think that's where you fall. And then I think it delegitimizes and again, like offers this kind of both sidesing. And I think it's really, really unfortunate that that's where it's come to. But that's the game that they like to play, and I refuse to play the game.
As a result of that debate and some of your comments on Hamas, you received like a slew of death threats. And I believe even there were possibly rape threats in there. They wanted Hamas to do to you. They wished that upon you, what had happened to other people on October 7th. I know it's not your first rodeo because you've been in the game for a minute talking about controversial things, but what does it feel like to get that? Like, how do you process that flooding into your inbox?
Yeah, like you said, I mean, it's definitely not the first rodeo. And I remember the Chris Kyle thing that happened, I think it was like before I met you. But yeah, I mean, I've gotten really, really extreme death threats and really graphic and explicit rape threats like directly before. So that was really tough. But once you've been through that, like the indirect threats are almost just become like, funny at this point, especially when Zionists just reveal themselves as so deranged when, this whole adjudication of the October 7th massacre and atrocities where mass rape was committed. It was the most reprehensible thing. We hate rape. Rape is the worst thing other than, of course, slaughtering someone. But for some reason, the first thing that these people will wish on you is for you to get raped by Hamas. And so there's this weird kind of Freudian nature of like revealing their own perverted and deranged rape fantasy or gang rape fantasy on someone who doesn't perfectly fall in or toe the line of whatever they want to paint happen on October 7th. And I found that really strange because I have never seen, well, to answer your question more directly, I got tons of indirect rape threats, which means I hope Hamas rapes you until your pelvis breaks. I hope Hamas rapes you until this happens. I hope Hamas gang rapes you. I hope this happens to you. So I think that they know at this point they can't be like, I'm going to rape you or I'm going to kill you. They want someone else to do it. And what was funny is I posted a couple of these on Instagram and my account was almost banned because of like incendiary commentary. And I was like, well, I'm not the one saying this. I'm just showing people what people are saying when you just refuse to condemn Hamas. This is the end result. Zionists became so unhinged that they actually just all wanted me to get gang raped. But how did it feel? I mean, at this point, it's kind of comical. I mean, I just log off Twitter, so I don't really see the influx of all the trolling because it was like a coordinated campaign, obviously, after that to try to, condemn me for refusing to condemn Hamas. But on Instagram, it was, I have to clean out my Instagram because that's permanently on my pictures and stuff. So it's funny because a lot of these people they have real profiles. They're posing with their kids and their grandparents. And it's like, how do you say this kind of stuff? And one really funny thing is there was this one guy who was a clinical psychologist and he's just out there basically saying, I want to wish that Hamas will rape you, basically. And it's like, you're a registered clinical psychologist in Illinois, and you actually took to the internet and wrote all this out, thinking that this gives you the moral high ground, that you want to wish this, but you won't wish it on me. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for doing that.
It's the derangedness of it in the first hand, the first front row seat you have. And also just as a sidebar, not to get into this too much, although it kind of leads a little bit into my next question, is like, what messes me up is how many of these people are probably claimed to be Christians or Jews and follow this guy named Jesus that I really see as a real pacifist and someone who would not talk like that and would totally be on the side of the Palestinians right now. So that's a whole other thing. And that the derangedness, the insanity of it, it drives me crazy. But on the issue of sort of religion, I'm curious, do you consider yourself to be an anti-Zionist? Like, would you subscribe to that ideology? Here's a state built around religious lines. We know the geopolitical strategy of why Israel exists, but are you anti-Zionist?
100% anti-Zionist. And, for a while it was kind of like I didn't know The answer to that question is like, I'm anti-Zionist, but I will follow the leadership of whatever Palestinians want to do. Like what I was saying about Hamas. I mean, the fact that they've already conceded that they would recognize a Zionist state if it was among 1967 lines. So it's like, it's not for me to say what Palestinians end up wanting to do, whether or not they want two states or one. But for me, especially having been to the West Bank is so atomized with settlements, it seems nearly impossible to have two states at this point, especially today. I mean, Gaza is completely gone. We've just let the utter obliteration of the Gaza Strip. So, but for me personally, absolutely, because I think when you have an exclusively Jewish state, it's not so much that that's the problem. The problem is having an exclusively Jewish state that is predicated on continuous expulsion. And you have to maintain policies of apartheid and military occupation in order to have that exclusivity of a Jewish state. The Jewish supremacy of the state is necessitated by ethnic cleansing and occupation and apartheid. So that doesn't make sense. So when people say, well, does Israel have the right to exist? You're never really parsing, what does that question actually mean? Are you saying, does an exclusively Jewish state have the right to exist on top of another state? Does it have the right to exist as an apartheid state? Does it have the right to exist as a military occupation? And I would say absolutely not. You cannot have that state while maintaining crimes against humanity. If Israel was just created in 1948 and didn't continuously try to expand, I don't think that any of us would be having this conversation today. Obviously, the Nakba was horrific. It was a crime against humanity, and I think that those people have the right to return. But I think that the nature of Israel is an expansionist state. And that's why we see them constantly encroaching on Syria and Lebanon.
Let's talk a little bit about empire. As someone who really is, I don't know, maybe the journalist who's reported most on the way the U.S. empire works in the world. Israel is sort of, to a degree, maybe one of the crown jewels, maybe the empire. So explain to people who don't fully understand, what is Israel in the U.S. empire? Why is it so important?
I mean, Biden articulated this a couple decades ago on the House floor when he said Israel is so necessary for U.S. interests that if it didn't exist, we would have to create her to serve our interests. I think you can look back at kind of Israel's utility for empire being exposed in the 1967 war when Nasser in Egypt, he was an independence leader, anti-colonial leader. Israel attacked him. They did a huge seize of land. That's where you saw more territories being completely conquered by Israel in the 6-day war, where tens of thousands of Arabs were killed, and I think just a couple Israelis were killed. And I think that really kind of showed the U.S., oh, this is like a really, really important asset for us. And the U.S. had already been sponsoring and defending Israel to a certain extent, but I think that was really the pivot where the U.S. kind of took Israel under its wing and realized its utility to tamp down on anti-colonial movements and independence movements in the Middle East. And so if you look at Israel's two neighboring states, I mean, two states that the U.S. is furiously trying to install regime change in, Lebanon, Syria, and then, of course, Iran is the big prize. And we see how devastating this risk of regional war that we're on the doorstep of because Israel is so out of control. But I mean, it's so obvious when you're just looking at who are Israel's neighbors and who are the so-called enemies of the U.S. I mean, the U.S. needs Israel to constantly bomb these countries, to constantly try to subvert and bankrupt them and, kill the resistance of Hezbollah and basically keep Assad at bay. I mean, so kind of Israel can have kind of plausible, not Israel, the U.S. can kind of have plausible deniability while it uses Israel as an attack dog in the region. And it's plopped right in the middle of the Middle East. Oil is the pivot of the modern industrial economy. And so the U.S. knows this is why we have all these bases in the Middle East, to have these geostrategic landmarks that we can keep all the oil flowing freely, to secure our interests and assets in the region. And Israel is the great ally, the greatest ally that we can have. And it's essentially the appendage of U.S. empire to have eyes and ears in that spot. and it does whatever we want it to do.
What's interesting, though, is it feels like since October 7th, we may be entering this watershed moment for U.S. empire, right? We're already hearing conversations about a shift into like a multipolar world instead of a unipolar U.S. hegemon. Do we think that this moment is signaling something where people are waking up to this relationship and it could change, the status of U.S. empire?
Yes, and it could get really ugly. Even though multipolarity seems like a really good counterweight, like Russia and China gaining strength and, against U.S. empire and not allowing the U.S. to do whatever it wants to, as well as Israel. This is how world wars do happen, where you have emerging states that are asserting their authority more and more when you have warring powers that are more equal than not. And so what I'm worried about is the multipolarity leading us down a path of world war again. And when you have the U.S. empire, which has had hegemony over the world for quite some time, and when you have a fanatical maniac state like Israel that really has no credibility left, and when they've relied on public perception this whole time, and when that's out the window and they're really willing to risk it all to go after Iran and drag the U.S. down along with them, or vice versa, I think it's a really, really big problem, because when you have two nuclear armed states like the U.S. and Israel, and when their power starts waning, they are going to lash out like petulant children, and there's going to be a lot of death and destruction that is going to accompany that waning power structure. So even though it is necessary and good to diminish the stranglehold that the U.S. empire has on the world, it's not going to come without a grave cost to humanity, Ryan, and that's what I'm most scared about.
That's a really great point. And we hear all these conversations in recent months, like Joe Biden could pick up the phone and end this. What is your sense on why he either hasn't done that or he has and Netanyahu's not listening? Because to end the genocide helps them, helps the United States. It's not good for the United States and what's happening with Iran right now and the chaos that's unfolding. Like, what's your read on that? Why the U.S. isn't exerting that influence?
I was asking that question for so long. Why is Biden risking his entire reelection chances by overseeing this genocide? Because that's really what he's doing. He was already dragging his feet in the polls in every swing state before overseeing and facilitating genocide. And it's because he is a Zionist. He is willing to risk it all for Israel, Ryan. I spoke to advisors, the education advisor that left the administration, that was appointed by Biden himself. He left in protest over the administration's handling over Gaza. And he told me that. He said, because I asked him the same question, why is Biden willing to risk so much by doing this? What is going on? What is it about this that could reveal why he's doing this despite all odds? And he said, the buck stops with Biden. Because like at the same time, it's like Obama, stood up more to Netanyahu than Biden is, even though Obama signed, this giant aid package and this and that. He stood up to Netanyahu. It seems like Biden is almost the most right-wing government we had ever had on Israel-Palestine, just giving Netanyahu a blank check, signing, that story that came out that he circumvented Congress over 100 times to give 100 separate arms sales to Israel since the genocide started. That's how much of an unabashed Zionist he is. That's how much he feels like Israel can do no wrong. And really, I think the buck stops with him. He's so rigid and unwavering in his Zionism at this age that he just is steadfast. He is willing to risk it all to do this. That's how much he devalues Palestinian life, and that's how much he values Israel as an asset to the U.S. I don't even think it could be advisors around him are just saying, this is madness, this is lunacy, we have to stop. But Biden is simply saying no, which is so crazy because we know that with one phone call, it could all stop today.
Right. I I want to make a joke about the Zionism being the last part to leave your lucidity as a human being, because it's very interesting to think, like you spoke so definitively about his take, but it's very hard to tell what he actually can conceive is actually happening. That's a low blow. Maybe I'll have to edit that part out. But I just thought...
No, it's true. It's like for the longest time, I was like, he's senile, he's being puppeted, he's like Weekend at Bernie's. But I think on this issue, I think like the older you get, the more rigid you are in your belief system. And he's just... He's unmoving on this one, man.
Right. When you see what Iran did the other day and the tensions that are so high, do you see that? How are you analyzing how high the threat level is? And in a way, are you glad's the wrong word, but some sort of response and fighting back to what's happening? Do you somehow sort of see that as important, even if it could lead to something devastating, which you were alluding to?
I mean, Israel's so out of control, Ryan, that as soon as they're just begging Iran to do something that they can escalate this into a full-blown regional war. We know that they have wanted to go to a war with Iran for decades. They're going constantly overstepping, assassinating scientists within Iran, bombing an embassy building, right? A consulate building in another country, an egregious violation of international law. They know that there's going to be no accountability for them. They know that the Western media will toe their line as soon as they do, and then it'll all be about Iran's potential retaliation. Iran's unprovoked attack. I saw some headlines saying that. A completely unprovoked attack. Really? Because it seems like Netanyahu is going there with a giant sign being like, please bomb me. Bomb us, Iran. I mean, they are just goading Iran so hard. And Iran knows this too. It's kind of like the assassination of Soleimani that Trump administered. And we were all waiting with bated breath. Oh my God, is this going to be World War III? But Iran's deliberate strike on just military base after that caused no casualties, I think, was their attempt to have a show of force without incurring casualties, because they know the second someone dies, then it's just going to be a tit for tat until we're all, hiding under our desk from nuclear weapons. So I think that Iran strategically and in a calculated way, first of all, they waited a week. And they were trying to beg the UN Security Council to do something, to condemn Israel, to do something about the fact that their consulate building was bombed. And they also had declared that if there was a ceasefire declared in Gaza, then they wouldn't have done anything. So Iran actually came out the level-headed player in this. As much as we like to paint Iran, these cartoon villains, they actually waited and they calculated their response, and they waited for the world to respond so that they didn't have to, and the world failed once again. So Iran did what they did. They had a show of force, and again, they targeted military infrastructure, unlike Israel, which targets civilian infrastructure constantly. And, I saw some military analysts say, even though this didn't seem like anything, it actually was really interesting because it made Iran... As a military strategist, this guy was saying, we saw how Israel could respond to actual ballistic missiles, how much the U.S. needed to intervene to make sure that none of those missiles hit. And we saw the response time from Israel and how much they had to put into that to prevent everything from going awry. So it was like we saw how much the U.S. was needed. We saw the amount of time and energy and price tag on trying to prevent those missiles from hitting. So in a way, it was actually really revealing in terms of what Israel can and can't do. So who knows if that was what Iran was doing, but I think that they were just simply trying to prevent anything further from happening. And that's why they deliberately struck the building where they weren't going to incur any casualties, because they knew if they were going to actually use full force that they were able to, then we would no longer be talking, Ryan, right now. We would be in a much different situation. So again, Iran comes out as a level-headed one. It was actually really smart and strategic. If they didn't do anything, they would be seen as weak. I mean, they need to respond to Israel killing 7 military. I think it was like 7 military commanders. Like the building was completely leveled. It's just absolutely shocking that they could just get away with this time and again. But I just am hoping to God that Israel does not do anything further. And who knows? I mean, they're so out of control. They really could.
It's a very good reminder on the diplomacy attempts that are always failing, and the other like assassinations just come out of nowhere to a degree, and we kind of forget about that when we see this and realize, just like October 7th, there's a long history and context here, and it's we can't look at it cartoonishly, and it's interesting to note those things. I need to ask you about grifters, please. I'm very curious. Like, I discern very strongly you're not a grifter. It's been proven time again. You put in the work. You care about this.
Thank you.
You've been there, and you're one of the legit voices. But there are people like you, journalists, influencers, who are become famous in this moment. You know, reporting on genocide. The whole world is watching. Everyone's numbers are up. Everything's going viral every day. There are people. I'm just going to name names, and if you don't want to become ad hominem, or you can disagree with me if you think I'm off base here, but people like Jackson Hinkle, people who are profiting off this by espousing pro-Palestinian ideas. Candace Owens has now become sort of a superstar for the Palestinians. But I wonder how you discern people like that, and how you can tell who's a grifter and who you choose to support and value, even if they're saying exactly what you believe and want. Where are you at with your like discernment hat on who's taking advantage of this genocide to make money and become famous?
It's a big problem, I think, in general with the alternative media space, is because there's such a fundamental lack of principles of, under capitalism and the foundation of like how media operates in the system. You have a lot of grifters in general just trying to seize on the algorithms or the 24-hour news cycle to just be the most inflammatory or incendiary so they can just get the most viral clicks and hits. And that's no matter if it's a mass shooting or a genocide. I think a lot of it's pretty gross to see. That's why, I mean, honestly, before the genocide started, I kind of had taken a long break off social media because I just felt like it was really hard for me to contribute in a meaningful way to the dialogue, because I just felt kind of grossed out in general by the rat race of it all. And so I was kind of trying to do more long form investigative stuff, but diving back into it, I see it. And on one hand, I totally get it, because Palestinians and the pro-Palestine side is so desperate for people in our camp because the institutional media has failed this movement so badly. It's probably the most egregiously one-sided coverage of all time of any conflict. And so I think people are desperate for validation and vindication, and they're desperate for truth. And so the viral accounts that are kind of seizing and capitalizing on this moment, I don't blame anyone who's sharing them or following them or appreciating that coverage, because I get it. But for me, someone who's been in this space for a long time and seen kind of the ebbs and flows of it, and seen who's just kind of disingenuous, it's demoralizing, but at the same time, you just have to keep doing what you do. And I think it's really revealed and exposed just the people who are the most popular accounts. It's like, what else are they saying? Some of these people were actually praising Netanyahu before the genocide. It's like they kind of blow in the wind with wherever the current lies. And, and for me, I think we just have to discern a little bit more critically, like, where's our news coming from? It's the whole critical media literacy thing. Like, where's our news coming from? Who's telling it? And what benefit is it to them? And so, I always try to ask myself that, but for the people who are jumping on this, it's kind of gross. And, I see a lot of these people just stealing Palestinians' content and just reprinting it as their own, whether it be Twitter or TikTok or Instagram. And that's really horrific, because it's like, now you're just literally stealing people who are living and trying to survive a genocide and grifting off people's work without crediting them. And that's horrific. So I will continue to amplify and lift up the voices of Palestinians on the ground who are actually living under this, instead of like white people in the West who are just, have no substance.
A lot of my interviews recently and in my own journey has been, I like talking about spirituality and kind of understanding where people are at big picture on looking at the world and purpose and what the hell we're doing here, especially in times like this. I was looking back at our last interview, and you referred to yourself as someone who was spiritual, but probably more labeled yourself an atheist. That's what you said. It was a long time ago. But I'm wondering, is there a worldview? Is there a spiritual practice that helps you make sense of the madness, gives you some sort of hope, if indeed you do have hope, that you're willing to talk about and yeah, is a part of your life?
I mean, it's a good question. I feel like I've done a lot of psychedelics, so that could speak to where my spirituality is based on. But I mean, especially living in Oregon now, I mean, honestly, it comes from nature and trees and the forest and moss and being out there in these enchanted forests and landscapes. And I just feel like that is my God, and that is my spirituality, and the oneness that we all have. Everything that separates us is just chance and geography. And so to just kind of have that realization on top of one another when you're out, especially in isolation in the wilderness, and realizing, how grateful you are to be alive and to be able to do what you do and to do what you love. And as horrifying as these times are and tumultuous and uncertain, especially raising children in the world, I still am deeply centered on that notion of just nature and how we all are one human family, as cheesy as it may sound. I mean, it's true. We are all connected. And that's where I just glean my passion and my morality through, is like, we're all brothers and sisters, man. And we're all in this struggle together, whether we like it or not. And we can all relate on a human level. And so that's why it's almost stranger for me to see something as horrifying as the Gaza genocide unfolding. And it's like, where is the humanity? Because for me, I don't discriminate. If I'm looking at a child suffering, I don't ask, where is this child from? Are they from Ukraine or Palestine? I am deeply moved by a child who is suffering. And if I can do anything about that suffering, if it's my government who is aiding and abetting that suffering, I will do everything in my power to change that situation. So that's where I come from, and probably, taking a lot of acid and mushrooms in my past has helped me kind of weave that weave that in my mind. But it's a beautiful thing, man. It's a beautiful thing, and it helps me stay sane amid it all.
And I would say none of that was cheesy to me, and I may have not dabbled at such a high level as you, but that whole idea of oneness and the ability to see that and find some sort of hope in sort of, in humanity and all of it, I think is powerful and it's important. I love the fact that that's a part of your practice, and it shows, I think, in your work and the empathy you bring to this. So you've given me so much time. I just want to say thank you so much. It's such an honor to reconnect with you. I'm sorry it has to be so depressing, and it's a pleasure to chat with you again, Abby.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really great talking to you again.